Louise Brooks, a star of the silent film era, spent her later years in a modest home nestled in Rochester, New York. The house, with its quiet charm and vintage atmosphere, was a far cry from the glamorous life she once led in Hollywood. After her death, however, the house became a place of strange happenings. It started subtly at first. Neighbors reported the odd flicker of lights from the windows late at night, as though someone was still living there. People would walk by and sometimes hear faint, distant whispers that seemed to echo through the walls, though no one was ever seen inside. Local residents would talk about how, on certain evenings, ancient melody songs that seemed to come from another era would drift from the house, carried by the wind. These haunting tunes, soft and melancholic, were familiar yet impossible to place, leaving those who heard them with a feeling of eerie nostalgia. Some believed it was the spirit of Louise Brooks herself, still lingering in her former home. Over time, more incidents were reported. Lights would flicker on their own in the dead of night, sometimes in the rooms where Louise used to sit and reflect on her life. The strange hum of old jazz records playing without a turntable became a recurring phenomenon, and the whispers grew louder, though no one could ever make out the words. Despite all this, no one could explain what was happening. The house remained empty for years, with only occasional visitors who claimed to experience these unsettling events. Some would try to dismiss the stories, attributing them to the house's age or imagination running wild, but the reports of whispers, melodies, and strange lights never stopped. The house on East Avenue became a place of mystery, its legacy forever intertwined with the ghostly echoes of the past. Whether or not Louise Brooks' spirit truly haunted the home remained a question, but those who knew the stories couldn't help but wonder if her timeless presence still lingered there, caught between the silent films of her past and the whispers of a world that had long moved on. As the years passed, the house on East Avenue continued to stand, weathered by time yet somehow preserved in its haunting stillness. The whispers and melodies became more persistent, as though they were trying to communicate something. Those brave enough to step inside often reported an unnerving sensation, as if the air itself was thick with memories, with a presence that seemed to be watching, waiting. One night, a local historian, fascinated by the tales of Louise Brooks and her mysterious home, decided to spend the night there. Armed with little more than a notebook and a flashlight, he hoped to document any occurrences that might provide an explanation for the growing rumors. As he settled into the living room, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The temperature dropped noticeably, and a faint smell of perfume lingered in the air, reminiscent of something old-fashioned and floral. The historian shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought as nothing more than his imagination. Then, just as he was about to take a few notes, the room darkened, the lights flickering until they finally went out completely. Silence blanketed the house, thick and oppressive. But before he could react, a soft, lilting melody filled the room, a tune that seemed to swirl around him from all directions. The music was so familiar, yet he couldn't place it, like an echo from a forgotten memory. He tried to turn on his flashlight, but it wouldn't work. The light refused to shine, and the historian was left in the pitch-black darkness. As his eyes adjusted, he saw faint shadows that seemed to shift and sway just beyond his vision. His heart raced. Were they real, or were they just a trick of the mind, brought on by the tension and isolation of the house? The whispers began again, low and indecipherable. They were coming from behind him, but when he turned around, there was nothing there. His breath grew shallow as he realized the whispers weren't coming from any living person. They were too soft, too distant. The air seemed to hum with their presence, as though the house itself was alive, responding to something unseen. Suddenly, a distinct sound broke through the whispers, a woman's voice, clear and unmistakable, though it wasn't in a language the historian understood. The words were strange, ancient, and yet carried an undeniable weight. He was transfixed, unable to tear his eyes away from the shadowy corners of the room. The voice seemed to beckon him, urging him to come closer, to understand what had been left behind. The historian's pulse quickened, but his legs felt heavy, as if the house were somehow pulling him in. He reached for the old staircase that led up to the second floor, his mind racing with both fear and curiosity. As he ascended, the whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a storm. The walls seemed to close in, and he could feel the very fabric of the house shifting, as if it were alive and breathing with him. At the top of the stairs, the door to Louise Brooks' former bedroom creaked open by itself, revealing a space that seemed untouched by time. The furniture, though aged and worn, appeared as though it had been meticulously arranged just days ago. In the center of the room, a large ornate mirror reflected nothing but darkness, its surface untouched by the years. But as the historian approached, he noticed a faint, almost imperceptible figure standing just out of view, like a shadow at the edge of his sight. Frozen, he reached out toward the mirror, his hand trembling. As his fingers brushed against the glass, a jolt of cold shot through him, and the figure in the reflection began to move. Slowly, it turned to face him. It was Louise Brooks, or at least it looked like her. The reflection of the actress stood in the room, her eyes locking with his, as if recognizing him. But there was something not quite right. Her expression was distant, as though she were trapped between worlds, staring back at him not with recognition, but with sorrow. The historian gasped, stepping back, but the figure didn't disappear. Instead, Louise's form began to shimmer, fading in and out, as if she were struggling to hold onto her place in the world of the living. Her lips moved, but no sound came from her mouth, only more of those haunting whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving the room in an unnatural silence. The historian stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, unable to process what he had just witnessed. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a chair, and as he turned to leave, the mirror's surface seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen hand. Before he could step out of the room, the door slammed shut behind him with a force that made the walls shake. He spun around in panic, but when he tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself was holding him in place, trapping him in its grip. The whispers grew louder, and the room around him seemed to pulse, as though it were alive. Shadows stretched and twisted, and the temperature dropped so drastically that he could see his breath in the air. In that moment, the historian realized that the house wasn't just haunted, it was alive with something far older and more powerful than anything he had expected. Desperate, he pounded on the door, his voice rising in fear as the strange melodies returned, louder than ever. But no one came. Only the whispers remained, echoing through the house, carrying with them a message he was not yet ready to hear. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The historian's heart hammered in his chest as he frantically pulled at the door, but it remained immovable, as though the house itself were a living, breathing entity holding him captive. The whispers grew louder, their tone rising and falling in a rhythm that felt almost deliberate. He could feel them pressing in on him, filling his mind with a mixture of dread and curiosity. Then the music returned. This time it was sharper, clearer, as if it was no longer coming from some distant, ethereal source but from within the walls themselves. The historian's mind raced. This melody, this was the one he had heard during the silent films of Louise Brooks, the same haunting tune she had danced to in one of her famous scenes. But how could that be? Was it possible that the house itself was pulling from her memories, from the fragments of her soul that lingered within these walls? With each passing second, the air grew heavier, and the floor beneath his feet seemed to tremble, as though the entire house was shifting in place. The historian felt a cold gust sweep through the room, even though no window was open. A faint silhouette appeared before him, a pale outline moving slowly toward him from the farthest corner of the room. At first, he thought it might be another vision, but as it came closer, he realized it was no mere apparition. The figure was a woman, her features indistinct, blurred like a painting left to fade with time. But her eyes were unmistakable. They gleamed with an intensity that stopped him dead in his tracks. They were the same eyes he had seen in countless photographs of Louise Brooks, now empty, as if staring into an abyss that he could not begin to comprehend. The woman's lips parted, But instead of speaking, her voice came not from her mouth, but from somewhere deep inside his own mind. "You don't belong here." The words reverberated through his skull, sending a jolt of panic straight to his core. He took a step back, but his legs refused to move. He was paralyzed, caught between the terror of the unknown and the undeniable compulsion to learn more. What did she mean? Was this Louise herself, trying to communicate across the veil of death? Or was it something else, something darker, something more sinister that had attached itself to this house? The shadowy figure advanced slowly, her movements unnatural, fluid in a way that seemed impossible for a human form. The historian's throat tightened as he struggled to speak, to demand answers, but the words stuck in his mouth. The figure stopped just inches from him. Her eyes pierced through him, and in that moment, he realized with a chilling clarity, she wasn't merely a ghost. She was the echo of a person, trapped, replaying moments over and over, unable to escape the cycle of memories that had anchored her here. Suddenly, the air shifted again. The house groaned, as if responding to some unseen force, and a sharp, sudden crack broke the tension. The walls trembled as if the structure itself were alive, shifting with the presence that had filled it. The historian could feel it now. The house wasn't just haunted by Louise Brooks. It was haunted by time itself. And Louise, as much as her spirit remained, wasn't the only thing tied to this place. The shadows seemed to ripple around the room, growing darker, more tangible, and the whispers turned into frantic murmurs. The historian could barely make out the words, but it felt like they were reaching into his very soul, pulling memories from deep inside him. They were never meant to leave, you see, trapped here by their own regrets, their own desires. His mind raced. What had he uncovered? Was it Louise Brooks' spirit trying to reach out, or was it something more insidious? A force that had claimed this house long before she ever stepped inside? In a flash of horrifying realization, the historian understood. Louise was not alone in this house. There were others, figures from the past, their memories bound to this space, trapped in a never-ending loop. And they weren't just spirits. They were something darker. Their energy was feeding on the living, calling those who were sensitive enough to their presence, pulling them into the fold. The historian finally broke free from his paralysis, but it was too late. He turned toward the door once again, his heart pounding as he sprinted toward it, slamming his shoulder against the wooden frame, but it wouldn't budge. As his panic reached its peak, the shadows around him seemed to stretch, elongating as if to surround him. He heard the faint sound of footsteps behind him, slow and deliberate. He turned, but there was nothing there. No figure, no face. But the whispers grew louder, growing into a cacophony of voices, all speaking in unison. "You should have left." His breath hitched, and he felt the cold touch of fingers on his shoulder, like ice creeping under his skin. The historian spun around, but the space behind him was empty, save for the swirling shadows that seemed to twist and pulse with a life of their own. The house was no longer just a place of memories. It had become something else, something alive. And now it was aware of him. It was calling to him, drawing him deeper into its grip. No matter how hard he tried to leave, no matter how fast he ran, he knew he was trapped. The house was changing him, blurring the lines between the past and the present, turning him into one of its many lost souls. In the distance, he heard the melody once more, a tune that seemed to play just for him, pulling him toward the heart of the house, where the truth and the terror awaited. The whispers didn't stop. They kept growing louder, until they seemed to swallow his thoughts entirely. The historian was no longer certain of where he ended and the house began, or if he would ever leave at all. The historian's pulse thudded in his ears, a rhythmic echo that seemed to match the rising crescendo of whispers in the house. His mind was racing, torn between an overwhelming urge to escape and a maddening curiosity to understand what was happening to him. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to get out before it was too late. But this house had its grip on him now. As he staggered toward the door once more, something impossible happened. The walls seemed to close in, their once sturdy foundations creaking and groaning, as if the house itself was shifting, adjusting to accommodate something new. The air grew thick with a foul, musty odor, like something ancient that had been left undisturbed for centuries. It was suffocating, and the historian's breaths became shallow, his vision blurring with each passing second. The whispers returned louder, more insistent this time, rising in a frenzied chorus. But now, amidst the growing cacophony, he could hear something different. A voice, clear and piercing, cutting through the noise like a blade. "You have to listen." The words reverberated deep within his skull, shaking him to his core. His body froze, not out of fear but out of compulsion. There was no escaping it. He turned, slowly, his body moving as if controlled by an unseen hand. The voice wasn't just calling to him, it was commanding him, pulling him toward the center of the house, toward the very heart of the mystery that lay hidden beneath layers of time. His eyes fell upon a door he hadn't noticed before. It was set in the far corner of the room, partially obscured by a heavy, moth-eaten curtain that hung from the ceiling like an old, faded memory. The door was ordinary, nothing remarkable about it, but it beckoned to him with an almost magnetic force, its handle glowing faintly in the dim light. With a trembling hand, he reached for the doorknob. As his fingers made contact with it, the temperature dropped drastically, a chill so intense that his breath fogged in the air. The handle was cold to the touch, like ice, and for a moment, the historian hesitated. But the whispers had become a deafening roar in his ears, urging him onward. "Open it. You have to open it." He turned the knob. The door swung open with a creak that echoed through the silence of the house. The historian stepped inside, his senses assaulted by the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to hang in the air. The room was dimly lit by a single, flickering candle on a small table in the center. Around it, the walls were lined with photographs, portraits of Louise Brooks from various stages of her life, her beauty frozen in time, her gaze intense and captivating. But it wasn't the photographs that held his attention. It was the feeling that lingered in the room. The air was thick with a sense of presence, as though something was watching him from the corners of the room, something unseen, something ancient. And then he saw it. A small, ornate box on the table beside the candle. It was old, perhaps as old as the house itself, intricately carved with symbols that seemed foreign, unfamiliar. His heart raced. He had to know what was inside. His hands shook as he reached for the box, lifting its lid. Inside, instead of the expected trinkets or keepsakes, there was something far more unsettling. A small, yellowed piece of paper, carefully folded and tied with a fraying ribbon. His fingers trembled as he unrolled the paper, revealing a message written in a delicate, looping script. "You are not the first to come looking." The words sent a shiver down his spine. The historian glanced around the room, as though the very walls were closing in, urging him to read on. The message continued. "There are others like you who have sought the truth, but we are all trapped here. The house keeps us because we failed to understand. We did not listen. If you continue, you will join us, and you will never leave." His breath caught in his throat. The room seemed to darken around him, the candle flickering violently, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. He felt as if he were no longer alone in the room, that the very air around him was filled with unseen eyes, watching, waiting. And then, in the silence, came the soft sound of footsteps. They weren't his. The historian froze, his body tense with terror. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, drawing nearer. They sounded like they were coming from behind him, and yet he couldn't bring himself to turn around. His eyes stayed fixed on the box in his hands, on the message he had just read. The warning was clear, but it was too late. He had already opened the door. He had already stepped into whatever this was. The footsteps grew louder, now almost directly behind him. He could feel a cold breath on the back of his neck, the hairs on his body standing on end. Slowly, he turned, his pulse pounding in his ears. Standing before him was the last person he ever expected to see. Louise Brooks herself, but not the graceful starlet frozen in her films. No, this was something different. Her face was pale, her skin drawn tight, as if the years had ravaged her beauty and left behind a hollow shell. Her eyes were empty wide, glassy, and filled with a profound sadness. She was no longer just a memory, a photograph on the wall. She was a part of the house, a part of its curse. She lifted a hand slowly, pointing toward the box in his hands. "You should have left it closed," she whispered, her voice cracking, a tremor running through her as though she were struggling to hold herself together. Before he could speak, before he could react, the room plunged into darkness. The candle went out. The whispers returned, louder than ever, all around him. They weren't just words anymore. They were commands. They were urging him to listen, to understand, to become part of the house like everyone else who had come before him. And then, in the darkness, he heard the door close with a final, resounding thud. The historian was no longer alone. The house had claimed him. The historian's heart raced as the darkness engulfed him, the whispers and footsteps surrounding him. Louise Brooks' pale, hollow figure loomed in the blackness, her eyes filled with an unspoken warning. He tried to move, to escape, but his body wouldn't respond. The house had him now, its grip tightening around him like a vice. As the voices grew louder, more frantic, the historian understood. He had crossed a line. The house wasn't merely haunted by memories. It was alive, feeding off the souls of those who dared uncover its secrets. The whispers weren't just warnings, they were the voices of the lost, trapped here for eternity, their regrets and desires woven into the fabric of the house itself. In the pitch-black room, he felt his body begin to dissolve, his consciousness slipping away as the house claimed him. His mind screamed in panic, but the house ignored his cries. It had already absorbed him into its twisted, timeless web. When the door finally creaked open, no one was left to hear the historian's name or the truth of what had happened to him. The house stood silent once more, waiting for its next visitor, its next victim. And somewhere, deep within its walls, the faintest whispers of Louise Brooks echoed, forever trapped, just like the rest. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.